Associate Professor Jamus.
Mr. Speaker, thank you for the opportunity to contribute to this debate. I had, during the Workers' Party's motion on this matter last year in this House, spoken about a number of concerns about gender equality in the workplace. To quickly recap, I explained why womenomics in Singapore still had a way to go. Married men are employed 1.3 times more than women, yet women earn 14% less. I had also suggested a number of practical steps to promote greater gender equality. These include reservations for female representation on board memberships in GLCs, increasing the coverage of childcare and primary schooling facilities in demographically young estates, paid re-entry programs for mothers and informal caregivers, and publishing aggregated and average pay gap information by industry sector. Today, I wish to share a number of reactions in response to the white paper on women's development. Consistent with my earlier speech, I will focus on Area 1 of the paper, on equal opportunities in the workplace. The report highlights 3 action plans to improve female labor force participation: flexible arrangements, FWAs, career mentorship, and flexible leave entitlements. I will share about each of these separately. Currently, the Ministry of Manpower parental paid leave provisions amount up to 18 weeks paid, of which 6 weeks may be taken up by fathers. The white paper suggests that this could amount to up to 22 weeks, with the father's eligible share bumped up to 8 weeks. Well, I think I can reverse engineer this figure essentially by adding up unpaid as well as paid infant care leave for each parent. Perhaps the government would be willing to clarify exactly how this discrepancy arises. Now, regardless of the calculations, while a move toward greater shared leave provisions undoubtedly represents an improvement, the policy still remains voluntary, and employers are only asked to consider FWAs, quote, fairly and properly, unquote. The only concession is that the consumption period for additional unpaid infant care leave will be extended for those in the public service from within the first 2 years. As my friend Sengkang MP Louis Chua has noted in his speech, the Workers' Party has, in our manifesto, explicitly called for a different shared parental leave scheme of 24 weeks, with a minimum of half of this to be granted to the mother and a sixth to the father. On its face, these may seem to be distinctions without differences. 22 versus 24 weeks, a maximum of 8 weeks versus a minimum of 4 weeks to be granted to the father. But if you indulge me, there is in fact a material difference. By imposing a maximum that the father can take, the law, as currently construed, embeds, if you will, an implicit assumption that the father is, in fact, the primary breadwinner. What if there's a couple where the woman out-earns the man? In this case, it would be financially rational for the woman to be the one returning to work, while the man remains at home, providing childcare. Fixing a maximum of 8 weeks for the father will preclude this possibility. Of course, this is not to deny the physiological changes a woman's body undergoes following delivery. And it is undeniably important that the body be allowed to rest and recover from the rigors of childbirth, lest the doctors in this house correct me on this. Research has shown, however, that the postpartum period can be divided into 3 distinct phases, with the second subacute phase, where the body undergoes major changes in hemodynamics, genitourinary recovery, metabolism, and emotional status, lasting between 2 and 6 weeks. Postpartum depression would also typically present itself within this time frame. This is why a 12-week minimum for the father makes sense, without ruling out the father as the primary caregiver thereafter. We should also recognize that just taking additional leave, even when fully justified and accounted for, isn't entirely costless. Being away from the office for a longer period will inadvertently delay or perhaps inhibit career progression. And this is especially the case for mothers who end up utilizing more of their leave entitlement. This is another reason why minimum paternity leave requirements can also indirectly help limit the gender wage gap from rising even further. More generally, the report calls for FWAs to be boosted to cover 40% of all employees by the end of 2022, but does not offer any similar commitment for the expansion of coverage of FWAs in the public sector, only stating that the public sector will, quote, take the lead, end quote. May I clarify that the government will, in fact, be committing to attaining the 40% target for those in the public service. Now, while I applaud the effort to expand mentorship, I have mixed feelings about how far mentorship can take us. Don't get me wrong. I am a mentor, both voluntarily and professionally, to students, and I see the enormous value that close mentorship can offer. This can be a wonderful idea if there are already sufficient women in positions of influence across a broad range of organizations. But this is a bit of a chicken and egg problem. If potential female mentors available remain small in number, we run the risk of either overtaxing this limited pool of mentors or a failure to break into spaces where women are currently underrepresented. What's worse, we pile additional stress on this group, which may even inadvertently inhibit their continued career progression because they have become preoccupied with non-professional commitments. The solution, it would seem, would be to encourage male mentors to step up. Now, this is certainly possible, but we would also do well to recognize the more challenging climate men face when asked to mentor the opposite gender. In a post-Me Too world, men have often become very cautious in both their language and advice for fear of being accused of sexual harassment. They may choose to withhold their most strident criticism, even if such critique may be constructive, or refrain from banter for fear of being perceived as sexist. This point was made by Anne Clark Wolfe, the founder and CEO of Independence Point Advisors, a women-owned investment bank and advisory, sometimes known in the business as Solomon Sisters. In an interview, Ms. Wolfe explained that the forces that led women to exit high-stress, high-remuneration jobs, such as those in finance, were not because they favored shorter hours or lower commitment. Au contraire, they left because they felt excluded. This absence of camaraderie may be ameliorated by genuine mentorship. But this is built over social settings like drinks and dinner. But many men today would be very uncomfortable engaging in such activities, even when above board with someone of the opposite gender. One is also left to wonder just how such opportunities would apply to women in more blue-collar or non-professional occupations. After all, the origins of apprenticeships was to transfer artisanal skills in trade work. Will the mentorship and networking plan apply with equal force to lower wage domains and occupations? The report takes a position that while it wishes to encourage and support women in achieving their leadership potential, it shuns tokenism, and in particular the, quote, unintended consequences of imposing hard quotas, unquote. On its face, this principle is surely indisputable. Even champions of greater empowerment are likely to be uncomfortable with being granted a seat at the table only by dint of their gender. Mr. Speaker, my concern is that this principled approach downplays the recent research on mandated representation and the role that it can play in shifting long-standing behavioral biases. In one study, when gender quotas are randomly assigned, and this is the gold standard for causal inference, in village councils in India, the prior exposure to a female leader gives rise to subsequent lasting electoral gains. In particular, perceptions of effectiveness of a female leader improves, and gender stereotypes about the roles of women in public versus domestic spheres weaken. In another study, mandated board representation in Norway led to an improved likelihood that women would subsequently secure leadership. After the advent of such quotas, gender gaps between males and females in terms of qualifications would also diminish, and a female CEO would also be more likely to be appointed. Thus, when mandated representation is actually pursued, both theory and evidence emphatically reject the notion that quotas would most likely be ineffectual, because quotas could improve talent allocation by overturning historical instances where such groups may have been deliberately excluded. After all, nobody truly believes that being a man predisposes one to computer engineering, data science, or finance. Overall, the body of evidence suggests that reforms of this nature have been successful in reducing historical inequalities, and power and norms do shift permanently, even in response to temporary interventions. All this points to something that is just as intuitive as a rejection of tokenism, that rebalancing the position of disadvantaged groups requires concrete corrective action, even if only for a season, to permanently shift attitudes and perceptions. Indeed, in countries that have moved to embrace gender quotas on corporate boards, there has been greater enthusiasm for such quotas, as well as more professional and formal approaches to board selection. Even in countries where there are no quotas, there is a growing recognition that market forces will not fix the problem on its own. Undoubtedly, we should not go overboard with trying to squeeze round pegs into square holes. The evidence also suggests that firm valuations may suffer excessively when the existing gap between mandated and actual representation is larger, or when the costs of compliance are too great due to the firm being too small to cope. That is why a limited quota could be a viable way forward. This would be akin to, say, a voluntary target, of a third of board seats being held by women, and holding this target for a temporary period of 10 years. It would only apply to the largest firms, therefore minimizing the compliance costs for small corporations. And a third seems eminently attainable, given how female representation is currently about 18%. And this will amount to a doubling from the present share. Here again, the public sector can be the one to take the lead. Even if we do not wish to excessively tie the hands of employers, will the government at least ensure that all government-linked firms aspire toward this voluntary target? And will the government consider requiring board-level training on unconscious gender biases, similar to the current requirement that board members undergo one-time training on sustainability for all listed corporations? So, about a decade ago, Sheryl Sandberg, the chief operating officer of Facebook, now Meta, co-authored a book entitled Lean In. The book, which went on to spark a brief movement, explained how she believed that women had to be bold and embrace self-promotion in order to succeed in the workplace. This thesis has since come under some criticism since, but the central metaphor, the need to be proactive in pushing for a seat at the table, applies, in my view, to how we should be advancing pro-women policy in our nation. It is in this spirit that I have found the action points outlined in the white paper to betray a somewhat lack of ambition. To be clear, the report represents a positive step in advancing the cause of true gender equality in the workplace. And hence, while I support the motion, I found the report to be sanguine in the role that government, through the public service, can play in ushering in such positive changes in the workplace. Charity surely begins at home, and the deafening silence on how the demonstration effect of government leadership by rolling out the proposed actions decisively within the civil service strikes me as inexplicable and honestly somewhat peculiar.